I didn't just build the table they were sitting at, I paid for the wood, sanded the grain, and hand-delivered it to the office in a rented truck 12 years ago. So, sitting at the far end of the boardroom, watching my brother Nate avoid my eyes while Dylan straightened his $1,000 tie, I didn't feel anger yet. I felt a strange, detached sense of vertigo. The room was packed with our best staff and two of our biggest visiting clients. I had just come from the docks, smelling like diesel and coffee, thinking I was late for a strategy meeting. Instead, I walked into a theater where I was the main character getting killed off. "Walter," Nate began, his voice thin and rehearsed, "we've decided to move in a different direction. Your role is being eliminated, effective immediately." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the confused glances of the two clients I'd spent 6 months landing. I looked at Nate and realized he wasn't just firing an employee, he was trying to delete his own history. Dylan smiled, pushing a cardboard box toward me. I didn't beg or yell. I simply stood up, buttoned my jacket, and picked up my black notebook. I walked out while everyone watched in total shock. I drove for 3 hours without a single destination in mind. The city lights blurred into long lines of neon as I replayed the boardroom scene on a loop. I gave Nate everything, 12 years of my life, my entire savings, and even my marriage, which fell apart because I was always at the warehouse. I even sold my small apartment to fund the company's first year of payroll. Because we were family, I never demanded shares on paper. I trusted my brother's word. I thought a handshake between brothers was stronger than any legal document. I was wrong. Nate's name was the only one on the official registration. I finally pulled into a quiet gas station parking lot and checked my phone. My corporate credit card was already declined when I tried to buy a bottle of water. Nate had moved fast. He had frozen my accounts and changed the office locks before I even reached my car. I had $200 in my wallet and a bag of clothes. For the last 2 years, I'd been sleeping in the back office to save the company money. Now, I was effectively homeless. I stared at the steering wheel, feeling the weight of the betrayal, then I opened my notebook. I ended up on my friend Ray's couch. Ray didn't ask a single question, he just handed me a pillow and a plate of warm food. He knew I had put my soul into that business. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my notebook and started reading from the very first page. It was filled with 10 years of my own handwriting, client names, private cell numbers, and delivery schedules. But then, I stopped at a section labeled Master Supply Agreements. I saw my signature. My personal phone number. My home address used as the primary contact for our 3 biggest manufacturers. Back when we started, Nate was traveling to find investors, so I was the one who signed the heavy contracts. I realized something huge, I hadn't signed them as a manager. I had signed them as the authorized individual signatory. Because the company wasn't fully incorporated yet, those contracts were tied to me personally. They didn't expire for another 18 months. Nate and Dylan had been so busy looking at the logo on the building that they forgot to check who actually owned the blood oaths with the suppliers. My hand was finally steady. For the first time since the boardroom, I breathed normally. The next morning, I walked into the office of Paul Greer, a lawyer who specialized in messy business breakups. Paul read my termination letter slowly, then he spent a long time looking at the supply contracts in my notebook. He didn't speak for 2 full minutes. He told me that since I never signed an official employment contract, the law might see me as a founding partner instead of an employee. That was a massive distinction. Then he pointed to the Corland Industries contract, the one that provided 30% of our total inventory. "Walter," Paul said, looking me straight in the eye, "your signature authority was never formally transferred back to the company. In the eyes of the law, these contracts are in limbo. Nate can't legally order new stock through these agreements without your specific approval. He thinks he threw you out on the street, but he actually just locked himself out of his own supply chain. Paul told me not to make a single move yet. He told me to let the silence do the work. I walked out into the morning air feeling a strange sense of power. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a ticking time bomb. I spent the next few weeks doing small consulting jobs. Ray had a lot of contacts with local businesses that had shipping problems. I worked long hours for small pay, but it kept my mind sharp. One afternoon, I walked into a logistics company that was having a huge dispute with a vendor. 3 other consultants had tried to fix it and failed. I sat down, looked at the manifest, and solved the problem in under 30 minutes by calling an old contact. I didn't realize the owner, Diane Stoll, was watching me from the doorway the entire time. When the vendor left, Diane asked me to sit in her office. She was a legend in the industry, tough, fair, and incredibly wealthy. She wanted to know why a man with my skills was working for hourly wages. I gave her the short version of the story. I told her about Nate, the boardroom, and the contracts. Diane listened without saying a word. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. She told me that Nate's mistake was her opportunity. She didn't just want to hire me, she wanted to back me. She saw the fire in my eyes that Nate had tried to put out. Diane's offer was incredibly clean. She would provide the capital, the warehouse space, and the trucks. I would provide the expertise and the contacts. We would start a new firm called Bridgemark Operations. I would keep 60% of the company, and she would take 40%. It was a better deal than I ever had with my own brother. I visited Paul Greer to have him check the paperwork. He confirmed it was a gold-plated opportunity. That night, I sat with Ray and talked about the risk. I had nothing left to lose, but I also had nothing left to prove to Nate. The next afternoon, I shook Diane's hand. As I drove back to Ray's house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a clear sense of direction. It was like a compass needle finally settling on north. I didn't call Nate to brag. I didn't post anything on social media. I just went back to my notebook and started writing a brand new business plan. I was using the same notebook that held 12 years of my brother's company, but this time, every single page was going to belong to me. I was building a bridge to my own future. I registered Bridgemark Operations LLC quietly on a Tuesday morning. There was no big announcement and no celebration. I rented a tiny office above a hardware store. It was just a second-hand desk, a chair, and a very fast internet connection. I chose the name Bridgemark because a bridge connects things that are broken, and a benchmark is the standard everyone else has to follow. I built the entire company around the 3 things I knew best: supplier relations, logistics systems, and being accountable. I knew Nate was celebrating his new era without me, but I also knew he was building on sand. I heard through old coworkers that Dylan was telling everyone the company was leaner and faster now that I was gone. He was cutting costs by firing the senior warehouse staff and replacing them with people who didn't know a shipping container from a shoebox. I felt a cold, quiet anger settle in my chest when I heard that. They really thought I was the problem. They thought I was just overhead that could be trimmed away. I just picked up my pen and kept working on my first client proposal. I knew the clock was already ticking for Nate's business. Bridgemark's first real client came through Diane's network. It was a regional food distributor that needed their entire supplier agreement system restructured. I delivered the project 3 days early and saved them 20% on their shipping costs. The referrals started coming in almost immediately. But then, the moment I had been waiting for finally arrived. My personal cell phone buzzed. It was a procurement officer from Corland Industries. He was calling about a routine renewal check for the master contract I had signed years ago. He had no idea I had been fired. "Walter," the officer said, "we're looking at the 18-month extension. We noticed your personal number is still the only authorized contact. We need to confirm the renewal volume and where to send the updated terms." I took a deep breath and looked at the wall of my tiny office. I told him politely that I would need to check some things and would follow up shortly. I hung up and felt my heart racing. This was it. Corland was 30% of Nate's business. I picked up the phone and called Paul Greer. I told him, "It's starting." Paul explained the legal reality to me very carefully. Because I was the authorized signatory and was terminated without any formal legal transfer of that power, Corland had every right to be confused. If I didn't provide clarity, they would be forced to pause all shipments to Nate's warehouse to avoid legal trouble. I could have just ignored the call and watched the company burn to the ground. Part of me really wanted to do that. I wanted Nate to feel the panic I felt in that boardroom. But I wasn't going to win by being a ghost. I wanted to win by being professional. I told Paul to send a formal legal notice to both Corland and Nate's company. The notice explained the situation transparently and requested a formal meeting to resolve the signatory authority. I wanted everything documented and above board. Paul told me that most people in my shoes would have just let the fire spread. I told him I wasn't most people. I wanted Nate to see exactly what he had thrown away. I wanted him to see that I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom he thought he owned. We sent the letters out that afternoon via certified mail. The notice hit Nate's desk the next morning, and my phone started ringing almost instantly. It was Nate. He didn't say hello, he just started screaming. He accused me of trying to destroy our legacy and called me a traitor. I stayed completely calm. I told him that this situation only existed because he handled my termination like a coward. I told him a proper legal process would have avoided all of this. He slammed the phone down. An hour later, Dylan called. His voice was smooth, like a snake. He offered me a small cash settlement to just sign the papers and go away. I listened to Dylan's entire pitch without saying a single word. He talked about moving forward and not holding grudges. When he finally stopped talking, I said, "I'll have my attorney respond to your offer," and I ended the call. Ray was sitting across the room watching me. He could tell by the look on my face that they were terrified. "They're panicking, Walt," Ray said quietly. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote down the date. "Good," I replied. For the first time, the power was in my hands, and I wasn't going to let it go easily. Paul rejected their tiny settlement offer the next day. We sent a letter laying out my full legal position. We also demanded a complete accounting of how the company had been managed since my exit, especially regarding the partnership questions. Nate's company had to hire an expensive corporate lawyer, and the legal battle began. While the lawyers fought, I kept building Bridgemark. I signed a construction supply firm and a large grocery chain. Diane was impressed with how fast I was moving. I was working 18-hour days, but I didn't feel tired. I felt alive. One evening, Ray showed me a message from an old contact at the warehouse. Nate's company had just lost a second major contract that had nothing to do with me. It was because they missed 3 shipping deadlines in a row. It was clear that the company was breaking down from the inside. Without my operational oversight, the systems were failing. I read the message twice and felt a pang of sadness for what we had built together, but then I remembered the boardroom. I set the phone down and went back to writing a proposal for a new client. I had to focus on my own house. I started asking some careful questions through my industry contacts to see what was really happening at my old company. The picture was even worse than I thought. Dylan had been cutting costs so aggressively that he was using substandard trucks and unqualified drivers. The cracks were spreading everywhere. Then, I got a call from Patrice. She had been my lead logistics coordinator for 4 years before Dylan fired her. We met for lunch, and she told me the whole story. She wasn't looking for revenge, she just wanted me to know the truth about what was happening. I sat there and listened as she described the chaos. Dylan was overpromising delivery times to new clients just to get their signatures, knowing the warehouse couldn't keep up. The staff was exhausted and miserable. By the time our food arrived, I had stopped eating. What she was describing wasn't just bad management, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Nate was so blinded by Dylan's efficiency talk that he couldn't see his company was falling apart. I realized then that I didn't even have to destroy the company. Nate and Dylan were doing a perfectly fine job of that themselves. Patrice told me something even more shocking. She had seen internal reports where Dylan was inflating the value of new contracts to make the company look more profitable than it actually was. It wasn't full-blown fraud yet, but it was very close. He was doing it to impress a group of offshore investors he was secretly talking to. He wanted to sell the company and take a huge commission before the whole thing collapsed. I sat with that information for a long time. I didn't leak it to the press or call the police. I had to be careful. I asked Patrice if she would be willing to sign a formal statement in front of my lawyer. She agreed immediately because she hated what Dylan was doing to the people we used to work with. I filed her statement safely in Paul's office and told her to stay out of the crossfire. I went back to work at Bridgemark. We had just been approached by Holloway Building Group, which was the biggest potential client in the region. I needed to be fully focused on that meeting. I told myself I would deal with Nate and Dylan one step at a time. My priority was my own success. The day of the Holloway meeting was the most important day of my career. Holloway was a massive construction firm, and they were looking for someone to handle their entire supply chain. Diane and I walked into their headquarters together. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Their operations director, a man named Craig, asked the toughest questions I'd ever heard. I didn't use any flashy slides or rehearsed speeches. I just told him exactly how I would fix their problems based on 20 years of experience. I was honest about the risks and the costs. At the end of the meeting, Craig leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long time. He said he'd met a lot of consultants who talked a big game, but I was the first one who actually seemed to know how the gears turned. He didn't give us a yes right then, but I could tell he was impressed. On the drive back to the office, Diane was unusually quiet. Then she turned to me and said, "That contract is ours, Walter. I can feel it." I didn't want to get my hopes up, but for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that something incredible was about to happen. 4 days later, Craig called. Holloway Building Group signed with Bridgemark. It was the largest contract I had ever closed in my entire life, even bigger than anything I had done for Nate. I sat alone in my tiny office for a long time after I hung up the phone. I thought about the boardroom, the night on the couch, and the long hours of consulting. I had done it. I had built something bigger and better on my own. But the universe wasn't done with the timing yet. That same afternoon, the Corland situation finally hit the breaking point. Corland was tired of the legal fighting between me and Nate's company. They sent a formal notice saying they were pausing all shipments until the signatory dispute was resolved. For Nate, this was a total disaster. Without Corland's inventory, he couldn't fulfill his other contracts. His whole business was about to grind to a halt. Nate called me that night, but his voice was different. The anger was gone. He sounded like a man who was watching his house burn down and realized he was the one who started the fire. He asked to meet in person. I agreed to meet Nate, but only if Paul Greer was there to represent me. We met at a quiet, empty restaurant. Nate looked like he hadn't slept in a month. His suit was wrinkled, and his hands were shaking. Dylan wasn't there, which was the first sign that their partnership was falling apart. Nate talked for 20 minutes about how hard things had been and how he didn't realize how much I did for the company. He tried to blame everything on Dylan, saying he was just following professional advice. I listened to him without saying a word or showing any emotion. When he finally stopped talking, I asked him one simple question: "Did you even read the termination letter before you signed it?" Nate looked down at the table and didn't answer. The silence was louder than his screaming had been. I realized that he had just handed the keys to Dylan because he was lazy and wanted to be the big boss without doing the work. I picked up my coffee and waited. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. I had learned that patience was a weapon. Nate looked at me and whispered, "I'm sorry, Walt." I just stared back at him. The meeting ended without a deal, but I got exactly what I needed. I saw that Nate and Dylan were now enemies. On the drive back, Paul told me his theory. He thought Dylan wanted me out specifically because my operational oversight was preventing him from faking the numbers for the offshore investors. I was an obstacle to his scam. I wasn't just fired because of a new direction, I was pushed out because I was too honest. That realization changed everything. It made the betrayal feel even more personal, but it also made my legal case much stronger. Paul told me it was time to file the full claim. We weren't just going after the contracts anymore, we were going after damages for wrongful termination and my share of the company's original value. We had Patrice's statement and the evidence of the inflated reports. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as we signed the paperwork. I was finally fighting back with everything I had. I went home that night and looked at my notebook. The journey that started with me being kicked out of a boardroom was finally reaching its climax. I was ready for whatever came next. Paul filed the claim, and the news hit the industry like a lightning bolt. Nate's attorney asked for 60 days to respond, but the judge only gave them 30. The pressure was mounting. Then, Dylan did something incredibly stupid. He approached Holloway Building Group, my biggest client, and offered them a secret deal at a much lower rate to try and steal them away from me. He was trying to kill Bridgemark before it could grow any larger. He thought he could outmaneuver me one last time. But he forgot that I had a real relationship with Holloway. Craig from Holloway called me the same day and told me everything. He even forwarded the email Dylan had sent him. I thanked him for his loyalty and immediately sent the email to Paul. It was the smoking gun we needed. It proved that Dylan was actively trying to interfere with my business. He had just handed us the evidence that would destroy his own defense. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Every move they made to hurt me was just making my position stronger. They were swinging wild because they were terrified of the man they had tried to discard. Paul added the Holloway email to our legal filing. The case was now a mountain of evidence that Nate's company couldn't climb. Meanwhile, Bridgemark was exploding. I hired Patrice as my full-time operations manager, and she brought over 2 of our best former warehouse leads. We moved out of the tiny office above the hardware store and into a real commercial space with a warehouse attached. On moving day, Diane brought a bottle of sparkling cider. She handed me a cup and said, "You built something real, Walter." I looked at my team working and I felt a deep sense of pride. I was standing in my own space for the first time in my life. No one could lock me out of this office. No one could freeze these accounts. I had built this with my own hands and Diane's trust. I looked out the window at the city and felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't the broken man in the gas station parking lot anymore. I was a CEO who actually earned his title. But I knew the legal battle wasn't over. Nate and Dylan still had one last card to play, and I had to be ready for the final showdown. Just when it seemed like we were going to win easily, Nate's lawyer filed a huge counterargument. They claimed that I had built Bridgemark using stolen trade secrets and client lists from my time at their company. It was a lie, but it was a lie that could slow down the legal process for months or even years. I went home that night and sat in my new apartment, feeling the familiar weight of stress. I knew they were just trying to drain my bank account with legal fees until I gave up. They wanted to win by outlasting me. I called Ray, who always knew how to calm me down. He told me that scared people always swing the wildest right before they fall. He reminded me that I had the truth on my side. I opened my notebook and started making a list of every single Bridgemark client and how we had found them. I documented every meeting and every referral. I was going to prove that not a single piece of my success came from Nate's company. I spent the whole night working. I wasn't going to let them slow me down. I was going to run right through them. Paul took their counterargument apart piece by piece. We showed that every single client we had came through Diane's network or my new reputation. But during the discovery process, Paul found something we weren't even looking for. He found a secret contract between Nate's company and Dylan. It showed that Dylan was promised a massive restructuring bonus specifically for removing me. The bonus was signed 6 months before the boardroom meeting. It proved that my firing was a planned hit, not a business necessity. It was the ultimate proof of bad faith and conspiracy. Paul slid the document across the desk to me. I read it twice, my heart thumping against my ribs. They had been planning to get rid of me for half a year while I was still working 18-hour days to keep them afloat. I set the document down very carefully. I didn't feel angry anymore, I just felt cold. The last bit of brotherly love I had for Nate evaporated in that moment. He had sat across from me at dinner for months knowing he was going to betray me. Paul looked at me and said, "This is the end for them, Walter." The discovery of that bonus document destroyed Nate and Dylan's partnership. Nate fired Dylan the next day, finally realizing he had been played by a shark. The news spread through the industry like wildfire. Without Dylan there to hide the problems, the full scale of the company's collapse became public. 3 more major clients canceled their contracts. Their main bank called in their line of credit. The company I had spent 12 years building was now days away from closing its doors forever. I heard the news and felt a strange lack of satisfaction. I thought about my father. He used to tell us that what you build together, you must protect together. Nate had broken that rule, but I didn't want to see our father's name dragged through a bankruptcy court. I called Paul and told him I wanted to make Nate a formal offer. Paul thought I was crazy at first, but then I explained my plan. It wasn't about being nice, it was about a smart business move that would also save my family's legacy. I told Paul to draft the papers immediately. It was time to end this on my own terms. The offer was very specific. Bridgemark would buy 40% of Nate's company shares at the current market value, which was almost nothing. In exchange, I would take over all operational control. I would bring in my systems and my people to fix the mess. I would resolve the Cortland contract dispute using my signatory authority. It wasn't a gift, it was a takeover. I met Nate in person to deliver the news. We sat in a small park. He looked like a ghost of the man he used to be. I handed him the folder and told him it was the only way to save his house and his name. Nate read the document slowly. The only sound was the wind in the trees. When he looked up, his eyes were full of tears. He realized that I was saving him after he had tried to destroy me. I didn't say it was okay, and I didn't hug him. I just told him that the business needed a leader, not a figurehead. I told him he could stay on as a minority owner, but he would never have a say in operations again. Nate nodded and signed the paper right there on a park bench. The war was finally over. The legal claim was settled as part of the deal. Nate formally admitted that I was a founding partner, which fixed my professional reputation forever. Dylan was left with nothing and was facing several lawsuits for his creative accounting. I walked back into the old warehouse for the first time as the new boss. The staff who had stayed through the chaos were lined up to greet me. A man named Earl, who had worked on the loading docks since the first day, shook my hand and wouldn't let go. He told me they knew I'd come back. I spent the next month working harder than I ever had. I integrated Bridgemark's technology into the old company and brought back the senior staff who had been fired. We stabilized the Cortland deal within 48 hours. The company started breathing again. I wasn't an employee anymore, and I wasn't just a brother. I was the majority shareholder and the person in charge. I spent my days moving between the 2 offices, making sure every pallet and every contract was perfect. I was finally where I was supposed to be. 6 months later, Bridgemark is the top logistics firm in the region. Nate's company is profitable again, and we are working together as a unified force. Nate and I have dinner every other Sunday. We don't talk about the boardroom, we talk about our father and the future. He has become a better man because he finally had to face the truth. I have a modest house now with a big porch where I sit and drink my coffee in the morning. I look at my hands and think about all the work they've done over the last 12 years. I don't regret anything. Losing everything taught me what I was actually worth. It taught me that a business isn't just a building or a logo, it's the people and the promises you keep. I built my life twice, and the second time, the foundation was made of something much stronger than a brother's word. I made sure my name was on every single page of the new story. As I look at the sunset, I know that no one will ever be able to take this away from me again. I am the master of my own contracts.